Welcome to Reward Nerds, the podcast that deep dives into the areas of compensation and benefits. My name is Jon, and I'm your host, and I'm your fellow Reward Nerd. Welcome to today's episode. Today, we're actually going to deep dive into the historical background of the EU Pay Transparency Directive, rather what led to it. So this isn't something brand new. It actually has a lot of history throughout Europe, unexpected places as well. And we're going to, dig into some of, it's not really fun facts, it's historical facts, but some of them are a little bit funny as well and surprising. So we're going to deep dive into that. And with that, I'm going to discuss this with somebody who is more interested in the historic aspect than myself, and that is Marie. Welcome.
Thank you, Jon. I'm both a female and I'm also interested in history. So we thought that it would be quite relevant for me to try and explain to everyone, where does this start? What's the run-up to actually presenting the EU Pay Transparency Directive? Because we've talked about it a lot and said, well, we've had equal pay legislation for many years. Why hasn't it worked? And why do we think that the EU Pay Transparency Directive will actually be successful and actually start making the gender pay gap smaller? So this is why we thought it would be interesting to look into some of the history and to understand the background.
Absolutely. And on it is important from the offset to talk about, when we're talking transparency, that is the new thing. And that's what's going to, and we'll go into that, right? That is what we're thinking could change things. Because, and everyone has been telling us for a long time, there's nothing new about equality or principles of equality. That's been around for a while, and we'll, of course, look into that. And then, again, has it worked until now? So basically, I'm just going to go through saying, so we're basically having a timeline that has bits and pieces all the way back to around 1700. And then more, you could say more intense from 1951 and 1957, but we'll go in through that. So around the background and maybe some of these inspirational, could call them heroes in this setting as well. And then some of the countries that were first in a lot of scenarios, but also some of them that were last. And I think at least one of them is kind of surprising, so let's see if somebody gets surprised around that. And in that relation, what has not worked? Why are we where we are today? So a directive that's going to be introduced in 2026, really, on these topics. I mean, a lot of people will be thinking, don't we already have these kinds of rules? But that goes back to this whole thing of saying the principles of equality is one thing. Has it actually worked is another one. And then all of this, presented through a historic timeline. So I think, sit back, nerd, enjoy, and then let's see if we can surprise you with a couple of facts along the way.
Yeah, we'll try not to make it too boring in terms of just mentioning numbers. But a good place to start is to say that the principle of equal pay has actually been a founding principle of the European Union. It is mentioned in the Rome Treaty, which was signed in 1957. It's in Article 119 that states that we have a right to equal pay for work of equal value, and that inequality is a barrier to free trade and a hindrance for the free mobility, which are the founding principles of the European Union. And these ideas actually go back to the mid-1800s, where the great European discussion about female emancipation kind of took off. It's been bubbling for many, many hundred of years before that. And if we look through history, we don't really see any female leaders, but there are some great exceptions, like Katarina the Great of Russia or Queen Margaret the First and the Second of Denmark. So there are some strong female characters in history that are national leaders or company leaders, but there are a few, right? But we start to see in the middle of the 1800s that there are a lot of thoughts about female suffrage, which means the right for women to one of the biggest thinkers around this area is a man named John Stuart Mills. He's a British philosopher and a social thinker, social scientist. And he writes, he writes many books, but two of them that are quite relevant for this is in 1848, he comes out with a book called The Principles of Political Economy, which, talks about political economy and how to make it grow. But then he publishes this, I guess maybe the, what can you say, like the fundamental work literature in this area, which is called The Subjection of Women. And in this, he has the audacity to suggest that gender equality is a fundamental part of a modern society. So in order to modernize society, we need to have equality. And he says that inequality becomes a barrier to evolution. So because of that, men and women are equal from the political perspective and from the legal perspective. So he's quite revolutionary when he publishes this work. He also states later on that he had a lot of help from his wife, a woman named Harriet. But she isn't actually mentioned. She's not highlighted as a philosopher or social scientist, but he does state later on that she was his main source of inspiration. But it's actually on his works that this whole idea of equal pay and equality between men and women are worked into the European Union.
And this is mid to late 1800s.
Yep.
So, there is a fair bit of time between that and now. And it's interesting, I think, because it's one of those things I would like to touch upon along the way is kind of this mix around, you have a timeline. There is certainly, women's power and women's rights movement as being a very pivotal part of this. But at the same time, it's the balance between that and the financial gains of it as well for a society. And I think it's a very interesting balance because you kind of could represent two political views and two standpoints and two directions. And the European Union from the offset has been a trade union, right? So that has been about the financial gains of trading with each other, etc. So more on that side of the political spectrum versus women's rights. And in a way, what you're saying in the Rome Treaty and that you mentioned in the beginning, in 1957, that it's one of these fundamental rights and principles of the European Union. And that actually has both of these scenarios in it. It's about the fairness piece, but it certainly is about, again, it's best for the economy and it's best for the trade and everything. So which is, again, back to the principles you just mentioned from 1870. I find that quite interesting because it actually still is one of the discussions we have today. We have to say that we're going to go a bit back and forth in time and history because we need to kind of put it into today's world. I have so many discussions with companies these days around, the whole directive and the impacts and the costs of fixing things. And certainly some companies are doing this because they have to. They're doing it for the compliance reason. And at least when I talk to company boards and company top management, there's always one or two individuals that says that's the motivation. They do it because they have to. Whereas if the principle of understanding the financial gains and how much better companies that have equality and pay equity, basically, you can still differentiate in pay, but pay equity, that they perform better. So the pure financial gains and efficiency gains and how much better a company or a society is actually what they gain out of it from GDP for a country or on the bottom line of a company. If you can even get that message through, which has been tried to get through since 1870, maybe some of these even skeptics of 2025 will start seeing it from a different perspective because it's looked upon as a pure cost in many cases for some individuals. So if you can get that element highlighted as well throughout the way, that would be highly interesting.
Absolutely. On the paper in front of you, you actually have that number, that gender equality is good for the economy because the EU Parliament think tank did researched this, and they came up with a number saying that BNP will increase with 0.1% whenever the gender pay gap is narrowed by 1 percentage point. Yeah. So I think that is definitely a valid argument, that it shouldn't be seen as a compliance issue. It should be seen as actually an economical gain.
Yeah. And in these days, where again we're recording this now in February 2025, and we've just heard the news. It's news now. It won't be in a while, I guess. But how ED&I is being challenged in the US particularly, and whether or not companies then start acting slightly differently because of this, because they may not have to report in the same way. If companies on the other side said it's the right thing to do. And by the way, it's even if they don't care about if it's the right thing to do, it's still a financial gain for the company to think about pay equity.
Yeah, Maersk has already stated publicly that they're not going to change their DE&I policies, despite what's happening in the U.S. right now. So.
Interesting. All right. So that's going to be me throughout this episode. I'm going to be interrupting with some crazy directions and interrupting the timeline, etc. Bear with me. But yeah, let's try to get this throughout some historic timeline again.
Yeah. So just to sum up what you just said, equal pay is a key element in the European Union because it is the prerequisite for a well-functioning internal market and to create fair and equal conditions for competition. That is summing up the European Union's take on John Stuart Mill's, which is where we started. I would like to highlight some of the firsts and lasts of female suffrage, female women's right to vote, because I think this is quite interesting, quite thought-provoking, actually. During the Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment, actually since the Middle Ages, basically, you've had this notion of equality that bubbles under the surface in literature, in prose. We see it in the oral traditions that start to be written down at this point. We also see it in archaeological evidence that there is equality. But it's kind of bubbling under the surface. But then in 1689, Frisia, which is a part of the Netherlands, they actually give voting rights to female landowners in local elections. So they're kind of a European first. Then we have an interesting period in the Sweden-Finland history where they have something called the Age of Liberty, which is from 1718 until 1772, where they actually give conditional women's suffrage, but this is then revoked when they have a new king. So we have this little window of equality. And then we kind of hit on the Industrial Revolution. And in the Industrial Revolution, everything kind of changes because there's a definite need for more hands. And there's this movement from the country into the cities, from being primarily
farmer society?
Exactly. Yeah, agricultural society to being an industrial society. And this kind of everybody, both men and women, have to take on sort of new roles with this new progress. I guess this is why we call it the Industrial Revolution, right? So during the Industrial Revolution, we see what we call the first wave feminism. This is where the histories of these so-called suffragettes that I think at least all the girls have heard about, right? Because this is where we start listening when we have history classes. We have all of these women that start fighting for the right for women to vote and to stand for election. In Denmark, I'm proud to say that one of the primary movers and shakers was a woman with the name of Marie Christensen, which happened to be my maiden name. So that's quite proud to share a name with her. But she was working 6 days a week in a household. And she spent her free time on Sundays walking through the back stairs because, servants were not welcome at the front door. So she would go and knock on the back doors to talk with other women that were in the same service as she was, about, their right to form a union, their right to stand together to get, better, work conditions. They wanted, for instance, to be able to have a little bit of time off, to have the right to go to church and have the right to go out and do something that wasn't decided by their employer. So this was sort of where it all began, I guess in Denmark, we're seeing in 1908 that women get the right to vote and stand for election at a local municipal level, and in 1915 at a national level. But before we start talking about Denmark, I think there's some interesting firsts across the world that might be relevant to mention. One thing I came across was that in 1882 in Iceland, women and widows and women of independent means were given the right to vote on municipal level. So again, this is sort of the powerful women that actually created a space for themselves in the economy are given the right to vote. And then we have in New Zealand, they become the very first country to actually provide equality for men and women to vote. So women above the age of 21 gets the right to vote. That happens in 1893. And then in 1906, we have Finland, and they become the first to grant complete equal rights. And then the year after, they actually have their first female minister. We talked about Denmark, and then we have the first female minister. And there is a debate about this because it depends on how you define a minister. But the first female minister is a result of the Russian Revolution, 1917, where you have, and I'm sorry for my very bad pronunciation of Russian names, but Alexandra Kolontas. She becomes a minister right after the revolution. But again, it depends on your definition of a minister. So if you have like the modern definition of a minister, we have to look again to Denmark and to 1924, which is 101 years ago, where Nina Bang, who was a social democrat, becomes Minister of Education here in Denmark. And then we come to some of the weird ones. You said, people could guess who might be the last. Well, I guess you already guessed that, or it probably isn't too much of a surprise to know that Saudi Arabia is quite late with women's rights. So in 2015, the women get right to vote on a municipal level. That's probably not too surprising. But then I have the kicker, the one that's very surprising, because in 1991, which really isn't that long ago when you think about it, right? Women get the right to vote in the Swiss canton of Appenzell-Innerrhodes. 1991 in Switzerland. Yeah, that kind of surprised me.
Yeah, it's not one that you might expect. Of course, on a national level, they've had the rights, but on the municipality level, that's very surprising.
Yeah, in the local canton.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we should move on to something that's a little more relevant for the EU Pay Transparency Directive. Now, we've given women the right to vote and to stand for election. We've had that for about 100 years, basically across all of Europe. So in 1951, the International Labour Organization, they adopt the Equal Remuneration Convention, which states that all countries should work toward equal pay for equal work. So
yeah. And that's exactly something that is still being debated today. What is equal work? That's where we go into nerdy stuff like job architecture. That's when you look at, what do you do with positions that are similar value but are completely different otherwise. And there's a lot of debate on this still. There's no clear answer everywhere around this. It's even... we could probably dig into some of these things from maybe even earlier than the 1951 and 1957 dates, around, what kind of representation is there in different work groups. So nurses versus policemen. You have this is still a debate going on today in plenty European countries and probably otherwise as well. What is work of equal value? Can you really say that it's more important to be a policeman than being a nurse? Is it, and what about teachers? What about, you have these different groups of individuals that all have an important point in society. You can't live without any of them, but they're doing different things. And some areas are overrepresented, being 80-90% almost of a certain gender in certain areas. And then they're paid differently in most countries anyway. And this has happened over time. It may not have been so from the offset, and maybe it has, but that's different from country to country, I think. But it actually translates all the way through. So that's big work groups. But then you have debates within a much narrower case. Within the same company, you then have the traditional one. It's the one I use the most often, is HR versus finance. If you have the same level of position, a lot of companies are saying that we should be paying the same. But reality is you may actually see a difference between, your finance people on the same level as your HR people, when you have taken into account, the impact of the position and all of these things. And some are then claiming, well, that's fair. That's the way the market is. You're just paying according to the market. Whereas others are saying, well, why is the market this way? Is it because there is an overrepresentation of males within the finance job family and an overweight of women within the HR function? So, it kind of it goes on for 100 years or so, and we're still not concluding. I would almost say it's 50-50 when I talk to companies in terms of what do they find fair, what do they find right to do in these cases, and it really isn't clear. But getting the transparency out around this is going to be very interesting. What is the impact going to be? And by the way, we're going to have a couple of court cases that's going to rule in favor of one of the other directions. So whether that's the European Court of Justice or a single municipality in an EU country that comes with the first one, let's see.
Yeah, that will definitely be interesting. Yeah, so I think one of the reasons why there might be this overrepresentation is cultural, right? And one thing I thought about when I was researching all of this is that, which kind of surprised me because, I'm Danish. I grew up in Denmark, and I kind of naively thought that, well, we have equality in Denmark, right? I see my parents, they do the same amount of work at home, So I think, well, we have equality. But then I read that all the way up and through like the 70s, the Danish labor organization still went out with, that their official opinion was that women should not be paid the same as men. You shouldn't invest in educating women as much because women were supposed to go and have babies, take care of families, take care of the elderly. So investing in a woman was less relevant than investing in a man. And this is in the 70s in Denmark. I was actually quite shocked when I read this. But to compare that, in 1919, we get the first collective bargaining agreement in the public sector in Denmark. It has equality. But we're all the way until 1973 before that happens in Denmark in the private sector. And we still don't see actual pay equity. So somebody, I can't remember who, but somebody did a calculation on this, and they say that it will take 116 years to reach pay equity in Denmark. And I thought, that is a lot of years. But then I read that the International Labour Organization, they think it's going to take 275 years to close the gender pay gap globally.
Yeah, with the developments we're seeing, if nothing happens, you can just, that's just putting out the regression out there and seeing how that basically moves. So I think that's just statistics. That's true, right? Unless something else happens. and then you need something else happening. I mentioned it in the other episode that we have launched as well. But just to mention it again here, I did analysis back in 20 years ago now, in 2004 and 2005 in the Norwegian IT sector, and looking at pay equity, and did regressions, and we did positions and looked at levels, etc. And the difference back then was 5% on base salary for doing exactly the same job. And did a lot of actually talk to the media around that, and talk to a lot of HR directors, etc., to saying, why is this the case, etc. And then my assumption is that a relatively regulated kind of industry and a country that represents equality. I would assume that gap was closed the year after. That was kind of my perception. Okay, they found out it was 5%, and actually, the CEO of the organization for IT industry in Norway was out in the media saying this is a disgrace. It's a disgrace that women are paid less than men within the Norwegian IT sector, and the difference was 5%. So I was kind of expecting 1 or 2 years ahead, it will be done. They will allocate funds slightly differently in the salary regulations, and all of a sudden it's going to be 2% and it's going to be closed. And I do the exactly same analysis 17 years later. And the difference is 4.8 on base and 5.2 including bonus. So absolutely nothing changed. So obviously if you go that way, it would take it even more than 274 years. It would just go on forever because nothing changed. But then you need some sort of, and this is to me kind of the wake-up call of saying something fundamentally needs to happen. I may not be in favor of somebody regulating things to happen, but it just proves that it doesn't happen by itself. So the transparency piece, and we're going to keep on going back to that. This is not, this is not just another pay equity directive. It's more, it's different. It's the means to reach it. The transparency is a mean to an end, you could say, which is about making sure that if people see the difference, they're going to feel the difference, and they're going to be informed about the difference, and it will be acted upon.
So if we're just going to quickly hop back to the timeline, we have 1951 with the International Labour Organization and the Equal Remuneration Convention. Then we have 1957 when we signed the Rome Treaty, which is the foundation of the European Union. And here it's especially important to note the Article 119, which is the one that states the right to equal pay for work of equal value. In 1967, the United Nations adopted a declaration against discrimination of women, and that also includes equal pay. And then finally, in 1975, we see the first European Equal Pay Directive. The year after, we get the Equal Treatment Directive. In 1976, the European Court of Justice ruled that Article 119 can be relied on by individuals against companies or other individuals, even in the absence of national legislation. Yeah, especially like you said, we're probably going to see a lot of European Court of Justice cases. And this is one of the things we spoke with Kira Marie Peter Hansen, who was the chief negotiator of the Pay Transparency Directive, and her advisor, and they were mentioning the lack of court cases as being one of the worrying things, which is why the Equal Pay Directive hasn't necessarily worked well. Because you have a directive, you have legislation, but it really comes into play when you start having court cases and you get this legislation tried and created precedents. So this is one of the things that they're opening the opportunity to actually bring more cases to court, hoping that might even out the equal pay gap.
Yeah, and then one of the observations from the offset that has actually been strengthened as well in my head too, is that who is going to bring this to the court cases? Now, one could argue that you may have the right that you just mentioned, in the ruling of Article 119, but who is actually going to use it? It's the kind of argument of saying, well, GDPR has been in legislation as well, but how many has actually asked? How many has actually taken it to court? And that's a fair argument, although this is different. And this is different for many reasons. But in this case, specifically, in terms of court cases, there may not be that many individuals that go to court with it. But unions will. They have absolutely every interest in the world of taking this to court. They have a lot of, you could say, legal reasons for doing so. And if they also feel that they have an actual reason to do so on behalf of one member or a group of members, taking this to court is something that is very likely will happen based on the unions. So they're going to play, as I see it anyway, a very, very big role in this directive to make sure it's going to actually happen. So if you're a company fearing that a union is going to take the entire lead in terms of what's happening, well, you better prepare then, right? So this is not really about making up two fronts that you're going to be fighting. But if you want to prepare, that means you need to be able to own a narrative. You need to make your analysis and sound analysis and fix whatever obvious issues you have, in due time. Because this is the expectations. The unions and work councils in some countries, etc., will have a lot of not only rights, but they will have a lot of power and do this. And you could even say finally, and without digging into the details of the directive itself, the individuals also have some rights. And it looks like they will have these rights even if they've been terminated from the company and potentially even, up to 3 years after that. So imagining the employees that your company has laid off, 1 year ago or in 2 years from now, etc. Some of these are not happy. Some of these felt discriminated. Some probably were. And all of a sudden they have the right to kind of get information around that retrospectively. And potentially, if they win a case, they could get some back pay. So there will be cases. I'm absolutely certain of it, and probably a vast number of them. The question is, of course, how will they all be ruled? Let's see, but the legislation should basically direct that pretty clearly.
Yeah, and one of the things that Kira highlighted was the fact that the burden of proof is reversed with the directive. So now it's up to the company to prove that they did not discriminate. Whereas before it was up to the individual to prove that they had been discriminated. Now it's the other way around. So I think this is quite an important part of the directive. Yeah, you were just talking about the issues with DE&I and the US as we're facing at the moment. I thought it was quite interesting to mention that in 1997 with the Amsterdam Treaty, we get what is known as the EC Article 13, which prohibits discrimination based on gender reassignment, pregnancy, and maternity. So even if, some superpowers do not think DE&I is important, at least I expect that the European Union will still, and European companies will still be working with DE&I. We also get a race equality directive and an employment equality directive at the turn of the millennium.
And now we have moved from 1700s to year 2000 in like 30, 40 minutes. Well done. So, and of course, a lot is happening after this, but this is, in terms of the historical perspective, this is key. And I think if we're just pausing there for a second, imagine how long time we're actually talking about. And in a way, of course, a number of important decisions have been made, a number of important points have been done. But what has actually happened in terms of the actual pay equity is probably relatively limited. And then the question is, from the year 2000 till now 2025, these 25 years, that's a much shorter time period. How much actually happened there? Well, I know for a fact, as I mentioned, in 17 of these years, very little happened in Norway, at least in the IT sector. So the question is, in many ways, how fast will something happen from 2026 until, let's just say, 2030? So that will be highly interesting.
So in 2006, we see the new Equal Pay Directive, which consolidates all of the existing directives on gender equality within the field of employment and consolidates this with the EU case law. So it ensures the fundamental right of not being discriminated by gender. and it removes the barriers to female labor market participation for the greater good of the economy. It's the basic principle. Again, it enforces the principle of equal pay, which was enshrined in the Rome Treaty.
And again, this for the greater good of the economy.
Yes.
Right? So that's proven by statistics. There's plenty of that. We're not going to deep dive into them. We also have not printed that. But the fact that is kind of stated clearly. So it's both, again, we've been talking a lot of the history here is kind of in many ways a woman empowerment thing and kind of a fight for the rights for women. That is still obviously part of the directive too. But at the same time, it's for the greater good of the economy. So that balance, I think, is so vital that people understand that this is not just about raising one side for the sake of that one side. This is about it actually also, for those that don't care about it, honestly, it still makes financial sense. And I think because we need to understand that even though the vast majority think and believe in fairness, there is still a number of people that don't, and a lot of these people have some power. So if we can even motivate these individuals to say, hey, it's a financial gain for you as a company as a whole to do this, then hopefully you can get a full movement.
Yeah. I found it quite interesting when you look at the map of Europe in terms of gender pay gap. You actually see that the former Soviet states are doing really well. And the former Western companies are doing not really that well. So I thought that was quite interesting. We see that, for instance, Romania and Slovenia have about like 3.6% gender pay gap, unadjusted gender pay gap, whereas Germany has 17.6%. Yeah. Anyway, so why I think that the 2006 Equal Pay Directive is interesting is because this is basically where everything about the EU Pay Transparency Directive starts. Because when you have a directive, you have to investigate whether or not it worked. So the Parliament starts looking into this after about 8 years, and they do a report on the implementation of the Equal Pay Directive that then leads to pay transparency recommendations, which is quite an interesting report that the Parliament publishes that talks about, why hasn't the Equal Pay Directive worked the way we had hoped? And they find that pay transparency, or rather a lack of transparency, is the main issue. So in that, they recommend, and they actually put this in writing, they say, have a job architecture. So I think this is quite interesting, especially from our perspective, right? Because we've talked about job architecture forever and ever and said, well, you need to make this. And we still see that most companies don't really have a well-functioning job architecture. So this is kind of where it begins, the work with the Pay Transparency Directive. The European Union has a statistical bureau called Eurostat, and they do measurements. And so they've measured the gender pay gap to be about 15.7% in 2018. And at the same time, the Eurobarometer asked all of a representation of the European citizens. And they came up with a number that said that 69% of the EU citizens believe that women are discriminated on pay. So it's kind of a known fact that we just discriminate women on pay. So I think that's quite interesting. When they were evaluating the framework of the principle of equal pay and equal pay for work of equal value, they identified some serious issues. They identified practical enforcement as one barrier. They identified legal interpretations, especially because of this lack of pay transparency and because of specific procedural impediments that vary from country to country. But in general, it's just really difficult for women to bring equal pay cases to court. And so their conclusion was that, stricter enforcement is not going to solve this. We need something else. It's a fact that women take on a larger amount of the unpaid labor in the home. It's a fact that women more often than men have part-time jobs in order to care for family, either children or parents. And, there is a limited availability of part-time jobs outside of certain female occupations, classical women's jobs. And this causes labor market segregation. So this is a problem because it basically limits the effect of the equal pay law. And, it also means that, we have a lack of male comparators. So, a woman who wants to know how her pay compares, well, she can ask the people around her, but they're all going to be women. So it doesn't really show, are the women paid different from the men? And this is because there are very few men in the classical women's occupations.
Yeah, and I think this is key to kind of split in two, because you have this scenario you're talking about now, where you have traditional groups of employees that are very, very dominated by one gender. If you're looking at carpenters, electricians, etc., it's very male-dominated, whereas nurses and a number of caring kind of jobs are female-dominated. So that's part of the directive. And this will be tricky in the sense of what is work of equal value then, because they fundamentally do something different. And that will have to be some court cases. And I'm sure there will be, as we said, some unions that will test this, which will impact massive groups. They may be on different union agreements, and the entire union agreement may be, in theory, at risk in a sense. So that's big. That's kind of the macro side of this directive. Whereas on the micro side, on the individual company side, you still have groups, of course, that are overrepresented and very largely so in some cases. But then it's all of these cases where it is the same, even the same job, but at the very least within the same area and the same level. And for this, I would just say that what we're working with companies on the most now one is getting some sort of a fundamental job architecture in place. That's a given. And again, as you say, many companies do not have one that's well functioning today. But the next step is culture. It's training of managers, because whoever you look at, if it's a company with 5,000 employees, they may have 700-800 people managers. And we know in terms of representation that there is still an overrepresentation in virtually every company I see in terms of how many males are there in senior positions. And, there are so many studies that everyone has some sort of a cultural bias and some sort of a gender bias and some sort of anything that is like me bias. So, even that you look at every individual manager, they may act individually in a fine way that you can kind of prove is all right-ish. But when you sum it up and do that by 600-700 managers, you're going to see a different trend. And that's what translates to a couple of percentage points here and there. And then all of a sudden, you have these differences. You may fix the issue. A number of companies are working on calculating what would it cost to fix the issue once and for all. But then it is key that it's also a cultural change. Otherwise, you will see these slight changes when you do promotions. Somehow, again, the small biases that we all have in us, we may not like them, but they're there. We have to understand that they were there. Then over time, you may give a slightly different number and you just add them up, and over time, that's where you are. Because every time a salary regulation is going on in the future, it typically is a percentage point of whatever salary you have. So if you're a couple of percentage points behind, that's just going to increase. So we see it in promotions. It's very, very challenging how they deal with it. And we see it, again, in recruitment cases. You may even, now with the pay transparency, you will have a range, and the salary range, that's your starting point. But where in the range do you place yourself? Where in the range can a candidate actually kind of end up? And that could still be, again, some biases and some cultural aspects. So this will be a large exercise in terms of culture. And we've mentioned briefly in the last episode around how do you tackle, one thing is salary increases during maternity and paternity leaves, and in most countries, maternity leave is longer than the paternity leave. So how do you deal with that? But and equally, how do you deal with promotions during the same time? So it's saying regulation is one thing, and which is also what they're saying. That in itself will not do. And thereby the compliance piece of this and the reporting piece of this is, to me, that's more like an exam result. But the transparency is what's there every day, how people feel and think about it when they see it. So it will be highly interesting, and I have plenty of could say hopes that the transparency piece is going to be the difference.
Yeah, I'm equally hopeful. I really have great faith in the European Parliament, and that they actually really did their homework on this. And this time, third time is the charm, as we say in Danish. I think this is going to be the time when equal pay actually happens. And this is because they've thought it through, right? They've realized that there's a need for transparency in order to empower women to take responsibility for their own pay.
This almost sounds like an ad for the Pay Transparency Directive, and that we think everything is perfect within the European Union. Of course, we've seen issues, with this, and of course there are some areas where we're thinking, that's pretty tough for companies to report on all of these areas, and it might thereby feel like a compliance exercise and an administrative burden, and that's kind of the negative parts of things, as well as what we talked about before with looking at averages instead of medians in some cases, etc., which isn't ideal. But despite these things, overall, we have to be honest and say we think it is a good directive. And we have no vested interest in itself by saying that this is just what we've seen. It looks like this actually can change something when you have the transparency around it. It is back to how are people with regards to fairness. It's like the concept of it, I think somebody defined envy being about basically how do you compare against your neighbor, right? If you have a car, then if your neighbor has the same car, only a slightly better model, you will still not feel as happy about your car as you did before you saw the neighbor had a similar one, slightly more fancy. And it's a bit the same here. You may be happy with your salary of 60,000 euros a year, but if you find out that the average of people doing the same as you is 62, you will immediately start feeling, how on earth am I below average? What did I do wrong? And this is regardless of gender, but it may be strengthened if you see that there's a gender representation and men are paid higher than women, etc. So you feel this may be the reason. So the transparency piece, I think, is absolutely key.
Yeah, definitely. And I have to say, I think I'm slightly biased being a woman, but I think this is fantastic because I have 2 girls of my own, and I'm thinking that with this directive, once they're old enough to enter the labor market, they're going to experience equal pay, which is something, me and all of the fellow women of my age have been struggling with. So there were 2 things I wanted to say about this. The one thing is the empowerment, which comes from the aspect of the Pay Transparency Directive that is the right to information. So, the employee gets the right to know how their salary compares to their category of workers. So that's one thing that's important. The other thing that's important is the legislation includes the obligation of the company to inform their employees that they have this right. So this is a way to get, well, especially female employees, the information on how does the judicial redress mechanisms work. Like, what are your options if you feel you're unfairly treated? What can you do about it? Well, you get the numbers. You can ask to get the actual number. With that, you can talk to your union, and they can help you bring this to a court case. So these are the things that are new and for lack of a better word, revolutionary, seen from the female perspective over here. So I think this is quite exciting. And I really do believe that this will make the difference. But it does require a lot of the companies. It requires the job architecture. We've said that a lot of times now. But it also requires a good pay philosophy. It requires that you look through all of your policies and you find those little loopholes. You can have somewhere that states, well, someone who isn't, on leave doesn't necessarily say women. It just says, an employee on leave does not have the right to promotions. Well, it may look neutral when you look at the policy, but when you think about it, who's going to be on leave? Primarily women. So because of that clause in your policy, well, then women don't get promoted as often. So that's an issue, right? You have to look through and see if you can find all of those places where there is an inbuilt inequality, even though it doesn't necessarily look unequal when you look at on paper.
Yeah, and I think we'll deep dive into those things in some episodes because some are around policies. They're key, but then culture, of course, needs to kind of enhance that because you can sometimes do stuff within a policy and outside of a policy based on your behavior. But on top of that, it is also variable pay that will be highly interesting and probably will be an episode by itself.
And this is a total remuneration directive.
The directive, shows you what the differences are on base pay and what distribution there is on variable pay and what it looks like when you include variable pay and what it looks like on total remuneration. We don't necessarily know all the details as to how the total remuneration piece will be defined. Do you actually put the value in internet connection per month type of value, or where do you limit it? Where does it stop? But at the very least, all the big key areas where you can put a monetary value on it. But yes, things like what are the criteria you're using in different scenarios. I've seen a number of places now where, for example, bonus is paid based on how many hours you put, basically, because it is how much do you invoice. And in a number of sectors, that's like a 1-to-1. How many hours do you work and what do you invoice? And thereby that is your what impacts your bonus. And in itself, that is, of course, objective. But when you look at the demographics of your company and leaves and children and all of these things, reality is what we see with the companies that have these kinds of practices is that they have a decent female participation in the lower levels of the company, and this completely changes throughout the levels. And these companies are not brand new; they've been around for many years. So it just shows that then they basically stop in the company because of it. They may get lower bonus payouts, but in the fundamental setup around it means that they're leaving, and you will not have as many females in senior positions. Right, and we have to emphasize this once more because it really sounds like we're all talking about female representation, female this, female that in everything. Number one, we are only talking about gender because the directive there is not a political will or a legal basis to do it wider than gender. So that's just key. This is, of course, the intention. It's not going to be any sort of discrimination, but it has to be within the frames of what's possible among 27 member states. And by the way, honestly, even if it was wider, I don't know any company that has the data to go much wider practically. But what a job architecture can do is they can be objective, it can talk about the position, and then regardless of the fact that whether there are some racial things, whether there is some handicap of one kind or the other, whether it's gender or any other parameter, sexuality, what have you, in theory, you get the same information and being compared to that. And if you differ from that, you may and may not have a case. At the very least, So I think that one is key. And this second reason we keep on mentioning the females in this scenario as much as we do is the fact that I think in every single company we looked at, women are paid lower. Even when you do the adjusted pay gaps. May not be by a lot, but it's there. The only cases where I have seen companies where the unadjusted pay gap is in favor of women, because I've seen that, is in companies where you have a large blue-collar population in production that is male-dominated. So we do present this as if this is a female issue in the sense of being underpaid, because it is. So just to make it clear, it's not a political thing that we're going with here. This is fact-based. It is an issue, and it is an issue in every single country that we look at.
Mm. But it's also a transitional period in a way that there's, in certain areas there's a scarcity of women. So, typical STEM industries, you have traditionally had fewer women that, took that types of educations, which means there's a scarcity of females to fill the positions. So that's one challenge. But it looks from the educational perspective like it's evening out. So the distribution is better now. There's a lot more females that go through university studying STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math than there used to be. So some of it will even itself out over time because we get young people that are more equally minded and that have had equal opportunities throughout life. So it is, in some sense, also a transitional period that we're facing right now and have been facing for the last many years. Basically, our generation has been the one facing it because our parents' generation kind of were the first ones where men and women were expected both to work equally. And, my grandparents, their generation, most women, at least here in Denmark, they were at home taking care of the home, or they were assistant wives. That was an actual title, assistant wife. My grandmother was an assistant wife to my grandfather. And it says, on paper, and that's in all of her official documents. That's what it says. That's her title. Then my parents' generation, men and women were expected both to have a job and both to contribute equally to the home economy. And then, our generation, we're seeing a lot more females entering some of those typically male-dominated studies. Like both you and I studied international business. And I remember and this was in 2000, right? And 2001 maybe. But we were in the first class, and we're there in the classroom, and we're about 90 people. About half of us are women. And this old male teacher comes in and he says, well, hello and welcome to international business. Especially welcome to you girls in here. You represent about 50% of the population. You're here to learn to think like men. And I remember being really, effed off. I was, how can he say that? Does he really mean that? But he was, old school. He did actually mean it. And we spent the next 3 years trying to prove that, well, we don't have to think like men. We have to know how men think. But women can think like women and still be successful. So it's just to say that when you talked about change management, well, that is probably the biggest barrier that we need to somehow face. Because there's so many unconscious biases as well. Like, for instance, one thing is, now we're doing a podcast, you're listening to voices, right? And voices is a place where we often have unconscious biases because we tend to put greater trust in voices that are deep. Well, men tend to have deeper voices. Ergo, men have greater trust. So there's a lot of stuff that we can work with. We can't solve it all today in this episode, but there are some things that we can help to solve with talking about how you can make the pay philosophy, how you can do the job architecture, things like that we will deep dive into in future episodes.
Yeah. And although this is also filmed, so it's a podcast episode and it's been filmed at the same time, when you're talking about generations and our generation, people may not have a clue about our age, but just we're both in our 40s and that's basically, so you get the context. We could have been in the 20s, we may sound like it, but that's more the childish part of us, I guess. Okay, so if we're going to start wrapping it up a little bit in terms of, okay, so we talked about the 1700s, 1800s. We looked at especially, 1951 with the ILO and the 1957, the Rome Treaty. Some developments you mentioned, 1975 with the Equal Pay Directive actually coming in, and then Equal Treatment Directive in 1976, and then the Court of Justice cases and Article 119 that you mentioned a couple of times from 76. And now we're in the 2000s. 2006, where you kind of gathered everything in one go, and then just getting us towards 2025, and then the vital time of 2026 that will be coming. What else do we kind of need to look at to kind of wrap things up around this? What do you think are key points that people should hear that we haven't mentioned yet?
Well, I think that there are two things that might be relevant to talk about. One thing is to sort of just highlight what does the Pay Transparency Directive say, just in case you didn't hear episode number 1 about the Pay Transparency Directive. The other one is to say that, the EU are still working on different directives that will be coming up or have, been implemented that touches upon this. And, it is a rule that now we have the Pay Transparency Directive. Once it's implemented, 8 years down the line, they're going to do another evaluation. And if it hasn't worked, that's when they will act. Like this EU Pay Transparency Directive was the result of that same evaluation of the 2006 Equal Pay Directive. So it's continuing. The work will continue. And we will be checking up on, is this working? Eurostat is collecting all of that information that all of the companies have to report publicly about their gender pay gap, and they will be monitoring this. So that was the one point. The second point is I think it's good to sum up what does the EU Pay Transparency Directive say you need to do. Well, the first is about recruitment. So you have to be able to show your salary skills in job ads. You are no longer allowed to ask for pay history. And you cannot make pay secrecy clauses. The second part is about salary and career. So you have to show your employees how their salary and career progression can pan out and how their salary compares. Then there's the one that, will be the right of every single employee in all of the EU, regardless of the company size. And I think this one is the one that gets the least attention, but in my opinion should get the most attention. It's the right to information. And we touched upon it. It means that come June 7, 2026, every individual gets the right to know how their pay compares to their average in the category of workers. So I think this is crucial. And then, the last piece is reporting, and that is sort of up to the implementation, because the directive says that, the member states can make an exception for companies that has less than 50 employees, but we don't really know yet because nobody has implemented the directive yet. We have many companies that are, on the verge of implementation. So we know that, for instance, it looks as if France will have reporting requirements starting at 10 employees, Spain and Germany probably around 50 employees. We also know that, the directive says, well, gender pay gaps of 5% needs to be looked into further, but in Sweden, it seems like it's probably going to be 3%. So there's some things that we know, but we don't know for sure because the countries have not yet implemented this. But we do know for sure that as a company, if you aren't prepared, it can be very costly. So how do you handle that? Okay, well, if we're going to sum that up in 5 seconds, job architecture. Have a job architecture. That's the basic fundamental part of what you need to do. The second is know your pay gap, because if you don't know the size of your problem, you cannot fix it. We have, one pay cycle left, basically, before the rules enter into force. So, you have one chance at fixing this. So, you need to know how you're going to budget for it. And you probably made your budget in November. So, how are you going to spend that budget? How can you fix your issue? Yeah. So those are the two things I think if you're not listening to anything else, just walk away with this notion, job architecture, know your pay gap.
That's great. I think that's a great summary because you can always add on things, but I think that's perfectly right. I would like to add, though, that you need to look into your policies as well. Otherwise, you're going to repeat the problem. You're going to get the thing that we just talked about before. You may spend immense amounts of effort and potentially immense amount of money to fix the issue and you're done. But if you didn't change anything in terms of your processes and your culture and your communication and these things, it will just basically revamp and get back to where you were. So let's make sure people get that into.
True, but start with the job architecture and knowing your pay gap because you have more time to fix your policies.
Absolutely, fully agree. Brilliant. That was a nice run through of a lot of history. A couple of, again, we shouldn't call them fun facts, but I do think the whole thing around Switzerland is kind of, that actually is funny. There's probably a good reason for it. So maybe some listeners from Switzerland, maybe even from that canton, can enlighten us and say, well, it makes a lot of sense because. But anyway, it sounds like a fun fact to us, and hopefully, this will make the difference that's needed. There is no reason why a woman should be paid less than a man for doing the exact same job. That's almost the words of Ursula von der Leyen in a quote back from 2021. So this is, as we see it, the background as to where it is now. Things have not worked. Things have not moved. There is a need for transparency.
And it makes economical sense.
So with that, I think we should say, thank you so much for listening in. And thanks for all the insights, Marie. I really appreciate it. And that you made a timeline and deep dive into a lot of these nerdy reports that needed to be Googled as well. So appreciate that. Thank you so much. Fun. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yep. And to everyone out there, thank you so much for also viewing, those that are doing that, and for listening in. We're looking forward to having further episodes with more nerdy facts with you. Thank you.